Have you ever kept a journal? And did anyone ever read it without your permission?
They told me they had nothing to spare. They said it the way people talk about a drought, like it is an act of nature, and not the result of someone turning off a valve. And I sat there nodding, because arguing with your own parents while your kid is hooked up to things you barely understand is a kind of pain that makes you pick your battles. So I said I understood, even though every part of me felt like it was being asked to apologize for needing help in the first place. The script was familiar in a way that still surprises me when I replay it, because my mom slid into that careful voice she saves for when she wants to sound both loving and unmovable, telling me that money was tight, that everything had gone up, that my dad's hours were unpredictable, that they were doing their best, while my dad cleared his throat and stared at the table and said they wished they could fix it, but they just could not, and I heard myself saying it was okay, as if I were the one trying to make them feel better about my son being sick. What you learn when life gets mean is that everyone has a version of mercy they reserve for emergencies, and you figure out pretty quickly whether you are inside that circle or just outside it trying to look dignified, and I was very clearly on the outside. Because the ask was not extravagant. It was not a new car or a vacation or a down payment on some fantasy. It was help covering the first wave of treatment until the insurance caught up and the charity program processed. It was bridge money, grocery money, gas money, all the small dumb things that become big things when you are counting receipts and deciding which bill gets to be late this week. I kept my tone even and practical because I did not want to give them any excuse to write me off as hysterical, and I laid out the numbers in plain English: the copay, the deductible, the out-of-network surprise, that one medication the doctor pushed for because it actually worked, and I explained that I could handle a payment plan if I could just stop the bleeding for a month or two, but the longer I talked the more I could feel this wall go up between us. Like they had already decided that their answer would be no, and my details were just background noise they would later call complicated. My sister texted me a heart and a prayer and a line about how everything happens for a reason, and I stared at it for a long minute because I wanted to throw my phone. Then I typed back that reasons are for podcasts and that what I needed, specifically, was help with the bill the hospital would not release my kid without, and she did not answer for hours, and when she finally did she said she would ask around, which is the soft way of saying nothing is coming. I am not proud of how I acted that week, because grief has a smell and it clings to your judgment, and I tried to be good. I tried to keep it all measured and polite. I sent updates to the family group with the facts, and I did not add commentary. I thanked people for rides and for sitting with my boy when I had to run home and shower and pretend I still lived in a house and not in a hallway chair, and I told myself my parents were scared, that maybe they were hiding their own crisis, that maybe there was a medical thing with my dad, that maybe their retirement account had collapsed, that maybe there was a loan shark in the picture, because the alternative was admitting they simply chose not to help. When the social worker gave me a list of programs and told me she had seen families get through worse, I believed her because I needed to, and I kept believing her even as I sold the little things that do not look like money until you watch them leave your house. The extra television, the old jewelry I never wore, the set of dining chairs my aunt swore would be worth something someday, and I told my son stories about how strong he was and how close we were to getting everything sorted, and I made myself sound convincing because kids can smell doubt, and I refused to let him carry mine. At some point my mom started dropping lines about how they were praying and how she wished she could trade places with me, which I did not ask for and could not use. And when I asked her again if there was any way they could cover the first month of the payment plan and I would handle the rest, she sighed and said she had looked everywhere and there was nothing left to squeeze. And I said I understood, because I have been trained all my life to keep the peace even when it means setting myself on fire for warmth I never get to feel. Maybe the turning point was not a single moment, but a pile of small ones, like the day I watched my son decide he did not want me to see him cry, so he stared at a spot on the wall and talked about a baseball player he liked. Or the morning the billing office lady called me sweetheart and told me how brave I was while reminding me that bravery did not count as a payment method. Or the message from a cousin I barely know saying she could send a small gift card and asking if my parents had stepped in yet, because that is what parents do when there is a crisis, and I typed a careful response that managed to be honest without being a grenade. People think revenge is a big gesture with dramatic music, but what I did that night was quiet and thoroughly on purpose, and if you have ever felt small around people who insist they are broke while finding ways to be generous in every direction except yours, you will understand why it felt like oxygen, because I built a simple shared document that laid out the costs with the clarity of a grocery list, line by line in words instead of numbers so nobody would miss the meaning, and I put next to each item a column titled Who Covered It So Far, and I shared it with the entire extended family, the church friends, and the neighbors who always ask how everyone is doing, and at the top I placed a note that said, in the most polite tone I could write, that my parents had asked me to let everyone know they were unable to contribute at all, so please do not pressure them, and I pinned that note to the group chat, and I let it sit there glowing like a little neon arrow. I told myself it was transparency, not spite, but I will admit the moment I hit send I felt a steadiness in my spine that I had not felt in months, and while my parents did not reply right away, a few relatives did. And the messages were the kind that changed the temperature in a room, and I knew, with a calm that scared me a little, that the story they had been telling about their empty pockets was about to be tested by people who keep score the old-fashioned way. And I went to sleep that night, knowing I had just lit a match I could not unstrike, convinced I was doing the only honest thing left, and completely unaware of what their money was actually paying for. When my mother called the next morning and asked me to come by because the shared document had caused a stir, and she wanted me to take it down for now until we could talk like grown-ups, I agreed. Not because I planned to undo anything, but because I wanted to see her face when she explained how a family that could not find grocery money for their grandson had managed to stay so impressively charitable everywhere else. And while I drove over, I rehearsed reasonable lines about keeping the peace and giving them space to fix it, but under that polite layer I carried a sharper question that would not stop repeating itself, which was simply whether they had ever planned to help at all, or if the kindness I kept waiting for had always been allocated to someone more convenient. She handed me her phone like it was a hot pan she did not want to hold, saying she did not remember the password to the document site, and asked if I could fix the visibility so the cousins would stop asking questions. And, because I know exactly how she handles technology, one opened the email app and saw a pile of messages that did not match the budget crisis story I had been told for months. Receipts flagged automatically from a bank for repeated transfers to a name I did not recognize monthly. Rent confirmations from a property manager I had never heard of, and a tuition notice from a private learning center that thanked my parents for being reliable co-sponsors. And before I could swallow the taste in my mouth, the phone vibrated with a bank alert announcing another transfer to the same name, a neat little note in the memo line that simply read camp fees. And I heard my own voice go very calm as I asked her who in the world was Elda Torres. She went straight into that practice tone that says nothing while pretending to be compassionate, explaining that I would not understand, and that families sometimes have complicated arrangements, and that none of it was my business. And when I said everything became my business the moment they told me they had nothing to spare while my child was being asked to wait, she lifted her chin and said I was being cruel, which is the kind of accusation people reach for when they have run out of honest answers, and I almost left it there because there is a part of me that still wants to be a good daughter even when the score is written in permanent ink. But then she slipped and said my sister was under a lot of pressure, and that this was not the time to make her life harder, and the room tilted, because I had not said my sister's name at all. I went looking for air and instead found a folder on the dining room sideboard, where my parents stash everything they planned to handle later. And sitting right on top, as if destiny had a sense of humor, was a thick envelope from the property manager addressed to my parents as co-signers and to a tenant named Jenna Ortiz for a townhome I had never heard of, complete with an updated lease, a schedule of payments, a record of repairs, and a list of emergency contacts that included my mother as Nana, followed by an email thread where the school thanked my mother and father for covering supplies for a kindergarten class and for organizing a holiday basket for the boys. And the final page was a photo of a cheerful certificate that included my sister's first name hyphenated with the last name in the lease, the kind of quiet paperwork people build when they want to call a secret by some gentler term than secret. I stood there trying to add up the pieces without falling apart, because on one side of the scale sat the week I begged for help and got lectures about prayer and prudence, and on the other side sat regular transfers, rent, preschool dues, and a smiling school calendar. And all of it told a story I never would have believed if you had pitched it to me like a television plot, except here it was with names and dates and subject lines, and when I asked my mother point-blank if my parents had been funding my sister's second household while telling me they were tapped out, she put a hand to her chest and said something about protecting children, which was the moment I realized she was saying the quiet thing without even hearing it. There are different shades of grief, and the one that showed up then was not the sobbing kind. It was the kind that sits in your bones and makes your voice low and steady. And I told her that I was not going to fight in her kitchen, and I would not be taking down the document because the only thing shameful here was the lie they had been living. And she said I was threatening the family, and I said the family had already been threatened by the choices they made when nobody was looking, and she told me not to make this bigger than it needed to be, and I walked out because I have learned you cannot debate someone who has decided that their comfort is the only truth worth honoring. On the drive home, I went back through every moment of the past year, and I kept stumbling over the times my sister had offered vague apologies about being stretched and trying to do the right thing. And it hit me like a hard door that she had not been stretched by rent or groceries or a child's dentist bill. She had been stretched by the logistics of running two lives, one that everyone saw and one that my parents paid for while calling themselves broke. And I felt something in me settle into a new position that was not forgiveness and was not rage either. It was a decision that I did not have to accept the premise of their story anymore. I am not going to pretend that what I did next was noble, but it was clean and it was deserved, and it did not require me to lie, because I took the property manager's number off the lease. And I took the phone number from a cheerful text my mother had sent to a group labeled Grandkids, and I put them next to the name on the bank transfer alerts. And I called the man I assumed was the partner of my sister's second life from a number he could not trace, and I introduced myself as a person who knew his rent was being paid by people who had told the rest of their family they were broke, and I said, very calmly, that if he loved his kids and wanted to protect them, he should ask Jenna who exactly was funding his home, and why she had to call it a scholarship when it came from her parents. And before he could press me for details, I told him to check the memo lines and the school payments, and then I hung up, because I did not need a fight. I needed a crack to open in the right place. By the time I put my phone down, there were already messages developing in the family group, little bubbles that suggested my mother's story was leaking, and I sat very still and listened to my own breathing. And when the unknown number called back and left a voicemail that started with my name and ended with a strained question about what I thought I was doing, I saved it. I did not respond. And I let the clock run, because sometimes the most powerful move is to light a small fuse and wait. And when my sister's text finally came in with my name in all caps and a demand to meet that night, I knew I had landed the first rail hit without touching a single person. And I knew that whatever happened next would not be something we could smooth over with a group prayer or a casserole. There are moments in life that divide everything into before and after, and no matter how many times you try to replay the details, the sequence always feels slightly warped, as if your memory is trying to protect you by sanding off the edges. But the night my boy died, I remember with a kind of sharpness that still makes my skin prickle, because there was nothing blurry about it, nothing softened. Just the sound of machines clicking down one by one and the hollow thud of words I never thought I would hear delivered to me in such a flat, professional tone, words that said he was gone, that his body could not keep up anymore, and that if the treatment had been started earlier his chances would have been stronger. Which was not phrased like an accusation, but landed like one anyway. I had spent that whole week in a sort of suspended state, promising him that things were being handled, telling him that the doctors just had to wait on paperwork, pretending that the phone calls I made in hallways were about logistics and not about me begging strangers to buy me more time. And when I came back into the room, he would always look at me with that mixture of trust and exhaustion that children carry when they are too young to know how unfair the world can be, and I would straighten my shoulders and tell him how strong he was and how proud I was of him. But the truth was that I was terrified every single second, and the terror had started to calcify into something heavier, something closer to rage. Because I knew that the only reason I was scraping pennies together in the first place was because people who could have helped chose to look me in the eye and claim they had nothing. The night itself was a cruel combination of sudden and slow, because one minute the nurse was adjusting a monitor, and the next there was this ripple of urgency, bodies moving faster, voices tightening, the doctor being paged. And I stood pressed against the wall as if giving them space could alter the outcome, as if not interfering might create room for some miracle. But then came the long minutes where they tried everything and nothing held, and eventually the silence fell in a way that told me before anyone spoke that the fight was over, and the doctor's face was heavy but not surprised, and he said things about probability and timing that I will never forget because they were both honest and devastating. What settled in me afterward was not the clean grief people describe when they imagine tragedy. It was a kind of poison that seeped through every memory I had of my parents' careful words and my sister's vague platitudes. Because I could not separate the loss of my son from the choices they had made, the checks they had written to fund a hidden life, the rent they had quietly covered while telling me there was no money left for medication or therapy or even basic copays. And when the social worker came in with pamphlets about grief counseling, I almost laughed, because the problem was not that I needed therapy. The problem was that the people who raised me had decided my son's survival was not worth rearranging their comfort. In the days that followed, I walked around in a state that I can only describe as function without presence, making calls about arrangements, answering texts from people who suddenly found their sympathy after staying silent during the crisis, nodding at casseroles being dropped off, and hearing again and again that God had a plan, that he was in a better place, that I should not blame myself, and every time someone said it was God's will, I wanted to scream that God had not signed those bank transfers, God had not written the rent checks, God had not chosen to fund a secret family while a little boy lay in a hospital bed waiting for approval to start treatment. And the only plan I could see was the one where my parents decided their reputation and my sister's comfort mattered more than their grandson's life. I know grief does strange things to people, and maybe what happened to me was just my mind's way of staying upright, but the strange thing is that instead of breaking me in the way I expected, it sharpened me. It cut away all the excuses I used to make for my parents, all the stories I told myself about how they must be struggling too, and it left behind a version of myself that was colder, steadier, and unwilling to keep pretending. Because once you bury a child because the people you trusted would not step up, there is nothing left to fear about confrontation. There is no scenario where keeping quiet feels safer than speaking. So when my relatives gathered and whispered about how sad it was, and how brave I was, and how sometimes life just takes, I smiled the kind of smile that holds back a storm, because I already knew that their story was going to collapse. I knew that the documents and the transfers and the photocopies sitting in my drawer were more powerful than any prayer chain or casserole, and I knew that the day would come when I would say out loud what they had done, not in private and not in whispers, but in a room full of the very people they had been lying to, and when that day came, the silence that followed would not be for my boy, it would be for them. What I did not know then, what I could not have predicted even in my darkest calculations, was how messy that unraveling would become, how quickly alliances would shift, how even the people who had defended them would turn once the details were undeniable, and how the same family that had asked me to accept prayer as payment would one day stand at each other's throats, not because I forced them to, but because the truth has a way of making people show who they really are. And so while I stood at my son's grave with dirt still under my nails and a numbness in my chest, I promised myself one thing with a clarity I had never felt before, that I would not let this story end as just another quiet tragedy. Because the only justice left to take was to make sure they could never again pretend that their hands were clean. In the weeks after the funeral, I noticed how quickly everyone around me seemed to want the surface of things to go back to normal, as if my son's absence could be folded into polite conversation and muted casseroles, as if grief could be managed like a leaky faucet that you just tighten when it starts to drip too loud. And while I accepted their condolences with a face that betrayed nothing, inside me there was a steady current building, a cold clarity that told me there was no justice to be found in patience or prayer, that if I wanted anything resembling balance, I would have to create it myself, not through violence or screaming, but through a kind of careful, deliberate exposure that would leave no room for excuses. What surprised even me was how well I played the role they expected. Because I answered their calls with a calm voice, I sent thank you notes to people who had given me nothing more than platitudes. I even let my parents sit across from me at dinner and talk about how family was all we had left, nodding politely while every word lodged in me like glass. And the whole time I was rehearsing not what I would say, but how I would make them reveal themselves in front of everyone they valued, because private confrontations would only give them space to twist the truth and make me sound bitter, but public truth has a different weight. It clings and stains in a way that no amount of spin can wash off. I started small, collecting things that on their own could be dismissed as coincidences, but together painted a picture that was undeniable, like the rent receipts with my father's initials on them, the text messages where my mother reminded my sister about the boys' dentist appointment, the photos on social media where my sister smiled with kids who were not supposed to exist in the family narrative, and the financial records that showed steady withdrawals timed perfectly with tuition payments at a school that no one in our family was supposed to be associated with. I kept them organized in a folder, not because I needed to convince myself, but because I knew when the moment came I would have to be precise. Because vague accusations could be waved away, but documented patterns were a cage they could not wriggle out of. During that time, my sister tried to bait me into private arguments, texting me long blocks of half apologies and half threats, saying she never asked for any of this, and that if I really loved her I would not destroy her life. And what she did not realize was that her life had already been destroyed the second she let our parents bankroll her secret family, while mine was slipping away in a hospital bed. So I responded with polite words and promises that we would talk when things settled. Never giving her the fight she wanted, never showing her the temperature of my anger, because I understood something she did not silence can be louder than rage when you let it hang long enough. My parents, meanwhile, leaned into the role of peacemakers, urging me to focus on healing and reminding me that dwelling on the past won't bring him back, and though those words could have gutted me in a different season of my life, by then they only hardened me. Because every time they tried to redirect my pain into vague spiritual comfort, it only confirmed that they were terrified of specifics, and that terror became the rope I intended to pull until everything unraveled in front of the very people they had fooled for years. So I attended every family gathering with a steady smile, hugging relatives, helping set tables, asking about their kids, all the while imagining the eruption that would one day replace the laughter in those rooms. And when I heard whispers about an upcoming reunion, a big one with cousins, uncles, church friends, and neighbors, the kind of event my parents prided themselves on hosting to maintain their image, I knew immediately that this would be the stage, because nothing strips a mask faster than truth delivered in front of an audience that matters, and my parents' obsession with appearing generous and faithful made them the perfect targets for exposure in the very environment where they thought they were safest. The days leading up to it were almost unbearable, not because I doubted my plan, but because holding back felt like swallowing fire, yet I reminded myself again and again that timing was everything. That I had already lost the one person whose life had given meaning to all my sacrifices, and that nothing I did now could bring him back. But I could at least make sure the people responsible for my isolation and my loss could never again sit at a table and call themselves honorable without being reminded of what they had chosen to hide. When the night came and I walked into that crowded house, I was greeted with the usual mixture of forced warmth and whispered pity, and I matched every handshake and every smile with one of my own, letting them believe I had finally found a way to move forward. Because I wanted their guard down, I wanted the moment when the floor shifted to be so sudden and undeniable that even those inclined to defend my parents would hesitate, because the evidence would be stacked too neatly, the timeline too sharp, the story too cruel to be brushed aside with a verse or a prayer. I told myself that what I was about to do was not revenge in the way people think of it, but rather correction, a way of writing the truth so loudly into the air that nobody could ever again pretend they did not know. And as I sat at that table listening to my father toast to family unity and my mother smile about blessings, I felt my pulse steady, because I was no longer the woman begging for scraps of help. I was the woman who held the ledger of their lies. And I knew that when I finally opened my mouth, the room would never be the same. And as I looked around and saw faces that had been carefully shielded from the truth, cousins who admired my parents for their supposed sacrifice, neighbors who thought of them as pillars of generosity, church friends who praised their wisdom, I understood in my bones that this was the only way to make it count, that what I carried was not just anger but proof, and that in the next breath I was about to destroy the version of my family they had spent years performing, not because I wanted chaos, but because chaos was already here, and it was time everyone else got to see it. I waited until the plates were out and the noise had settled into that comfortable hum people mistake for peace, and when my father lifted his glass to talk about family, I asked for a minute. Not because I wanted a performance, but because I wanted every person in that room to hear the same words at the same time, so I stood and thanked everyone for showing up. I said I appreciated the prayers and the casseroles and the messages that arrived when it was already too late, and then I told them I needed to clear up one small misunderstanding, which is that my parents did not fail to help because they had nothing. They chose not to help because the money they claimed did not exist was being sent, like clockwork, to the second life of my sister. A life with rent and tuition and neat little memos about camp fees that came through with the steadiness of a salary. And if anyone wanted to argue with me, I had brought copies so nobody had to rely on my memory. You should have seen the way the air changed, not because I gave some dramatic speech, but because I started reading like I was going through a grocery list, line by line, the transfers labeled with the same few names. The lease that put my mother down as a contact under the warm title of grandmother, the school messages thanking my parents for being reliable sponsors, and I watched cousins stop chewing and church friends shift in their seats and neighbors glance at each other. And I kept my voice level because I did not need volume, I needed clarity, and clarity was more than enough, especially when I said, calmly and without decoration, that while these payments were made, my son was waiting for treatment that would have given him stronger odds if it had started sooner, and that I was told there was nothing to spare. My mother tried to interrupt with the word complicated, which is what people say when they are asking you to forgive what they are unwilling to explain, and my father reached for authority, asking me to sit down in my own parents' house. And my sister started crying with that shaky breath she uses when she wants to turn the room into a sympathy machine. So I kept going because I had expected every move on this board, and I said nobody needed to take my word for anything since I had attached the documents to a message that would arrive in everyone's inbox before dessert, a message written in plain language with the receipts right there. And that if anyone had questions about who exactly was living at the townhome on the lease, they could ask the person standing at the edge of the driveway, because I had invited him too, and he had a few questions of his own. If that sounds cruel to you, let me remind you that I did not lure a man into a lie. I did not fund a household behind a partner's back. I did not help hide children from a family that thought it knew everything. And I certainly did not stand in a hospital hallway telling my daughter to pray while moving money to a second address. So when the doorbell rang and he walked in, confused and angry and holding the voicemail he had replayed more times than he wanted to admit, I stepped aside because his conversation was not my responsibility to manage, and when he asked my sister to explain who was paying his rent and why her parents were listed as emergency contacts for boys he had been told to keep off the family radar, the room split like a bad seam, not because I raised my voice, but because the truth finally had a body. From there it went the only way it could, with relatives asking hard questions that had nothing to do with God's will and everything to do with choices, with church friends trying to hold two opposing ideas at once and dropping them both, with neighbors realizing that the couple they had held up as the standard of generosity was generous in a way that had a very selective definition, and with my parents cycling through denial, spin, and the kind of anger people save for the moment they realize their audience is no longer cooperating, while my sister blamed stress and fear and the fact that life is messy, which might have earned her a pass in another context if the cost had not been my child's odds. The revenge, if you want to call it that, was not the invitation or the copies or the steady voice. It was the simple refusal to keep their secret for them any longer. And the last move was the cleanest because I told the room I had already formalized what I could not get in life, that I had created a scholarship fund in my son's name for families caught in the same delay trap that cost us everything, and that the seed money came from checks made out by my parents to that other household which I had redirected through a reimbursement mechanism using their own documentation, meaning that from this day forward every time someone asked about their generosity I could say, with a straight face, that yes, they helped a child, just not the one they thought. They shouted then, a lot of people did, and someone knocked a glass over, and my mother called me heartless while my father said I had humiliated them, and my sister accused me of destroying her life just to make a point, and I told them, in the calmest voice I have ever used, that I did not destroy anything. I just turned on the lights, and while they kept yelling, I picked up my bag, walked to the door, and left them to argue with each other, because they were the only ones who had earned that fight. In the days that followed, the message did exactly what I expected, which is that the house they built out of appearances started to creak under the weight of facts. And some relatives tried to triangulate peace while others took a step back to reevaluate who they had been applauding all these years, and my parents kept their silence except for a single text from my mother asking if I was happy now, which I answered by sending the link to the fund and a simple note that said this is what happy looks like, and whether anyone thinks I went too far is not my problem because I did not push anyone off a cliff. I simply made sure the story landed where it belonged. So if you are asking whether I won, I will tell you this. I am not celebrating, I am not healed, I am not even done grieving, but I am finished pretending, and that is victory enough, because I took the last thing they had left, which was their performance of goodness, and I gave it back to the only person who never got a vote, and if that makes me the villain in their version, I can live with that, since I did what a mother does when the world pretends not to hear. I made them listen, and I am not sorry.